Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quietest moments drift gently into your dreams. Tonight, we begin a peaceful journey through one of history's most bewildering royal families, the Hanoverians. From German kings who couldn't speak English, to mad monarchs, to extravagant princes buried in debt, the story of England's most disconnected rulers is both fascinating and deeply, profoundly strange. We'll explore 5 monarchs who seemed utterly disconnected from the very kingdom they ruled. Kings who lost colonies, lost their minds, and lost the respect of their own people. Yet through it all, they remained on the throne, oblivious to the world crumbling around them. Before you settle into the comfort of your pillows, we'd love to hear from you. Drop a gentle comment below telling us which royal story fascinates you most. No pressure, just when you feel like it. And if you've enjoyed these quieter tales of history, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. We upload these soothing documentaries regularly, and having you here makes our whole community feel like home. Now, dim those lights, find your coziest position, and let the strange tales of disconnected kings carry you gently towards sleep. Welcome to the Hanoverian chaos. George, later known as King George III of Great Britain and Ireland, arrived in England as perhaps history's most unlikely monarch. He was a German prince who spoke barely a word of English, who had no real desire to be king, and who viewed his new kingdom with the kind of bewilderment most of us reserve for foreign tax codes. Our story begins not in England, but in Hanover, a small principality in northern Germany. In 1660, Ernest Augustus was born into the House of Hanover, a family that would soon become one of Europe's most peculiar dynasties. The Hanoverians were intelligent enough, certainly educated beyond most standards of the time, but they possessed a particular kind of tone deafness that seemed to run in their blood, like an inherited disease. George William Frederick, who would become George III of England, was born on May 28, 1660, in Osnabrück, Germany. His early life was one of quiet competence. He grew up in Hanover, learning the languages of European diplomacy, German, French, Italian, and a smattering of Latin. But English, that was never considered necessary. Why would it be? He was a German prince, destined to rule a German principality. The idea that he would one day sit on the throne of England would have seemed as likely as a kitchen maid becoming an empress. His childhood was typical for European nobility of the period, formal, structured, and designed to create a ruler, rather than a human being. He learned statecraft, military strategy, and the careful art of European alliances. He was trained in the protocols of court, the nuances of diplomatic correspondence, and the politics of inheritance. But he was never trained in empathy, in listening to his subjects, or in understanding the particular pride and traditions of the English people. In 1682, when he was 22, George married Sophia Dorothea of Chell. It was a political marriage, as most royal marriages were. Sophia Dorothea was intelligent and lovely, and for a time, the arrangement worked. They had 2 children, George William Frederick, who would become George II, and Sophia Dorothea. But the marriage would not survive the pressures of court life and George's own emotional distance. For most of his life, George IV never expected to be King of England. He was perfectly content being the Elector of Hanover, managing his small German state with reasonable competence. But history, as it so often does, had other plans. In England, the succession was becoming a complicated matter. Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, had ruled England for 12 years. She had 17 children, yet none had survived to adulthood. Her last surviving son, William, Duke of Gloucester, died in 1700, at just 11 years old. By the time Anne herself was dying, in 1714, the question of who would succeed her had become urgent. The English Parliament, still smarting from the Catholic sympathies of the Stuart line, passed the Act of Settlement in 1701. This act declared that the crown could not pass to any Catholic. This eliminated a number of potential heirs, including Anne's own half-brother James, who had been forced to flee England during the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Instead, the Act declared that the crown should pass to Sophia, the Electress of Hanover, who was descended from the Stuarts through her mother Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of King James I. But Sophia died just weeks before Queen Anne, so when Anne herself passed away on August 1st, 1714, the throne passed to Sophia's son, our George. George was 54 years old. He was living in Hanover, managing his German state, and had no intention of leaving. The journey from Hanover to England took weeks. He didn't speak English. He had never set foot in England before, and yet the British Parliament had declared him king, and duty, or perhaps obligation, meant he had to go. The journey itself was a kind of reluctant pilgrimage. George travelled slowly across Germany, then to the Netherlands, and finally across the Channel to England. He arrived in Greenwich on September 18, 1714, and was formally proclaimed King George I of Great Britain, France, and Ireland. He was given a royal welcome, yet his face, according to contemporary accounts, bore an expression somewhere between confusion and resignation. The first problem was language. George I spoke English so poorly that he conducted most of his official business in French or Latin. This immediately created a distance between him and his subjects. Imagine being ruled by a king who couldn't address Parliament in his own kingdom's language. It was unprecedented, and it was deeply unsettling to the English people. George made little effort to learn English properly. He was too old. He considered it beneath his dignity, or perhaps he simply didn't care enough to try. Instead, he retreated into the comfort of his native German and French. This linguistic barrier became symbolic of his entire approach to ruling. He was present, but not truly present. He was king, but not truly king of England. The English court was horrified by many of George's habits. He was used to German court life, which operated on different principles than English court life. He found the English nobility strange and incomprehensible. He was uncomfortable with their informality, their boldness, their lack of deference. They found him remote, cold, and unable to communicate even basic wishes and preferences. One of the most striking aspects of George's personality was his complete lack of interest in English culture. He didn't visit the major attractions of his new kingdom. He showed little curiosity about English history, English literature, or English society. He viewed England as a prize won through genealogy, not as a kingdom to be understood and loved. More troubling still, George was accompanied to England by two German mistresses, Melusine von der Schulenburg and Sophia Charlotte von Kielmansegge. These women were older, neither particularly beautiful, and both had borne George's illegitimate children. Yet he elevated them to positions of honour in the English court. Melusine was created Duchess of Munster, and Sophia Charlotte was made Countess of Darlington. This caused considerable scandal among the English nobility, who were appalled by the sight of these ageing German women being given honours normally reserved for English ladies of high birth. George III's relationship with Parliament was complicated from the start. In Hanover, George had been an absolute ruler, not quite as absolute as some European monarchs, but absolute nonetheless. He had issued decrees and laws without consulting anyone. The idea of Parliament having significant power was foreign to him, but England had a Parliament, and Parliament had significant power. This was not something George could simply dismiss or override. During the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, Parliament had fought hard for its rights. By the time George became king, Parliament was no longer simply a rubber stamp for royal decrees. This created immediate tension. George wanted to rule as he had ruled in Hanover. Parliament wanted to maintain its prerogatives, and George, being unable to speak English fluently and having little interest in understanding the English system of governance, retreated from direct involvement in the daily workings of Parliament. This created a vacuum. Someone had to manage Parliament. Someone had to negotiate with the various factions. Someone had to be the voice between the king and the legislators. That person became Robert Walpole, who would serve as England's first Prime Minister. Walpole was clever, shrewd, and understood how Parliament worked. He began attending cabinet meetings on behalf of the king. He became the king's chief minister, his intermediary, his representative. George was comfortable with this arrangement because it meant he didn't have to struggle to communicate or deal with Parliament directly. And England was comfortable with it because Walpole was far more effective than George could ever be. This arrangement, a king too distant and uninterested to truly govern, and a prime minister effectively running the country, became the standard during George III's reign. It worked in its way. England prospered during these years, but it set a precedent that the king could remain aloof from the actual business of governing. The crown could be a symbol, while real power lay elsewhere. If George's relationship with his kingdom was distant, his relationship with his family was actively toxic. George had come to England without his son. George William Frederick, the future George II, remained in Hanover for over a year after his father became king. When he finally arrived, the relationship between father and son was already strained. Father and son despised each other. This was not a mild disagreement or the typical tensions between generations. This was active, open warfare conducted within the walls of the palace. George V believed his son was incompetent. George II believed his father was a fool. They argued constantly. They refused to speak to each other if it could be avoided. They held rival courts, with different factions of nobility supporting each one. The situation became so dire that at one point, George III banished his own son from the palace. George II was forced to leave court and establish his own residence elsewhere in London. Father and son, who lived in the same city, could not occupy the same room without an atmosphere of hostile tension. This family dysfunction was more than just personal unhappiness. It had political consequences. The English nobility had to choose sides between father and son. This created two rival power bases within the kingdom. It weakened royal authority. It demonstrated to the English people that their king was incapable of maintaining basic family relationships, let alone governing a kingdom. There was one more scandal attached to George III, one that revealed his complete inability to navigate emotional or personal matters with any grace. While King of England, George maintained his relationship with Melusine von der Schulenburg. Everyone at court knew about it. Parliament knew about it. The English people knew about it. And yet George made no effort to hide it or to pretend otherwise. Melusine was given apartments near the king's. She was seen in his company constantly. She was given influence over court matters that should have been beyond her authority. More shocking still, George gave her gifts of considerable value, money, land, and titles that belonged rightfully to the English crown. This was not merely infidelity, which was common enough among European royalty. This was a foreign woman being given English honours, English property, and English wealth. It was George treating his kingdom like a personal resource to be distributed as he pleased, with no consideration for the English people or their traditions. If George III was indifferent to England, he was positively dismissive of Scotland and Ireland. These kingdoms had been united with England under the 1707 Act of Union, just 7 years before George's accession. Scotland was still adjusting to this union, and there were significant numbers of Scots who deeply resented English rule. There was also the matter of the Catholic Stuarts. Many Scots and Irish, particularly in the Highlands and the rural areas, remained loyal to the Stuart line. They saw George as an usurper, a foreign German king who had no rightful claim to their throne. The Jacobite cause, the attempt to restore the Stuarts to the throne, remained a significant force in Scottish and Irish politics. George did nothing to win over these people. He made no effort to understand Scottish culture or traditions. He spent no time in Scotland or Ireland. He seemed to view them as conquered territories rather than kingdoms united under his rule. This indifference would haunt not just George I, but his successors as well. Despite all these problems, George III's reign was relatively peaceful and prosperous. There were no major wars. The economy grew, culture flourished. England was becoming a major power in Europe. Perhaps this is the greatest irony of George I's reign, that a king so disconnected from his kingdom, so unable to communicate with his subjects, and so uninterested in understanding his realm, should preside over a period of relative stability and growth. But this wasn't because of George. It was despite him. It was because of Walpole's capable management of Parliament. It was because of the natural economic development of England as an emerging commercial and military power. It was because of the talents and efforts of the English people themselves. George III was like a portrait hanging on a wall, an icon, a symbol, but not an active participant in the life of the kingdom. George III ruled England for 13 years. In that time, he never truly became English. He never learned to love his kingdom. He never even learned to speak its language properly. By all accounts, he was counting the days until he could return to Hanover. In 1727, George decided to travel back to Hanover for an extended visit. He was 67 years old, and his health was failing. On June 10, 1727, while travelling between towns, George suffered a stroke. He died just days later, on June 11, 1727, in Osnabrück, the same city where he had been born 67 years earlier. He died in Germany, not England. He died speaking German, not English. And when the news reached England, their primary feeling seems to have been one of relief that his reign was over, and curiosity about what his son would bring to the throne. George III's legacy was not one of great achievement or memorable accomplishment. It was the legacy of disconnection. He had shown that a king could rule without truly engaging with his kingdom. He had demonstrated that royal authority could be delegated to ministers, and he had set the stage for a new kind of monarchy, one that was increasingly symbolic and increasingly removed from the actual business of governing. But this was only the beginning of the Hanoverian chaos. His son, George II, would take all of these problems and make them exponentially worse. George William Frederick, who would become King George II, was born on November 10, 1683. He grew up as a Prince of Hanover, in the shadow of his father's increasing remoteness and his mother's increasing unhappiness. Unlike his father, George II would grow up to be interested in England. He would learn to speak English fluently. He would study English history and culture, and yet he would prove to be, in many ways, an even less suitable king than his father. George II was characterized by anger. This wasn't the controlled, dignified anger of a powerful ruler. This was petulant, explosive, often irrational rage. He would lose his temper over the smallest matters. He would shout and curse at courtiers. He would throw things. He would turn red with fury at the slightest contradiction or disagreement. This angry temperament was evident early in his life. As a young man, he and his father were constantly in conflict. George II believed his father was weak and incompetent. He believed that Walpole had too much power. He believed that England should be governed by a strong hand, not by a distant king and a manipulative minister. In 1705, George II married Caroline of Ansbach. This marriage would prove to be one of the most interesting aspects of his reign, and also one of the most troubled. Caroline was intelligent and cultured. She came from a family of minor German nobility, and unlike her husband, she possessed a certain grace and understanding of human nature. George II was genuinely attracted to Caroline in a way that most arranged marriages did not produce. There was even love in the relationship, at least at first, but George's explosive temper and his inability to control his emotions made even this relationship a source of constant tension and distress. Caroline bore George several children, including Frederick, the future George III. The birth of these heirs should have brought stability to the relationship. Instead, it intensified George's paranoia and his sense of rivalry with his own son. He would later treat Frederick with the same contempt and hostility that his own father had shown to him. When George II died in 1727, George II immediately became king. He was 43 years old. Unlike his father, he had spent more than a decade in England. He spoke the language. He understood, or thought he understood, how the English system worked. One of his first acts as king was to attempt to break with Walpole and to establish himself as a truly active monarch. He wanted to be involved in governing. He wanted to make decisions. He wanted to be a powerful king, not a figurehead. But George II's active involvement in governance proved to be more problematic than his father's passivity. George II had strong opinions about everything, but these opinions were often based on incomplete information, emotional reactions, or simple stubbornness. When his ministers disagreed with him, he would rage. When Parliament proposed legislation he disliked, he would threaten and protest. Walpole, who had served George III, remained as Prime Minister under George II, but the relationship between king and minister was far more volatile. George II was constantly threatening to dismiss him. Walpole was constantly on edge, uncertain whether he would keep his position from one day to the next. Just as George V had driven a wedge between himself and his son, George II did the same with his own son Frederick. The pattern of Hanoverian kings and their heirs seemed to be one of deep and abiding hostility. Frederick, born in 1707, grew up in the English court. He was, by all accounts, charming and sociable, qualities that neither his father nor his grandfather possessed in abundance. Frederick understood English culture. He was interested in English affairs. He had a genuine popularity among the English people. But George II despised him. George II was jealous of Frederick's popularity. He was suspicious of Frederick's intentions. He worried, irrationally, that Frederick was plotting against him or attempting to gather supporters. The more popular Frederick became, the more George II resented him. By the 1730s, the relationship between father and son had deteriorated to the point of active hostility. George II banished Frederick from the court. Frederick established his own household, his own court, and his own faction of supporters. Father and son became rivals, with the English nobility once again forced to choose sides. This family discord had serious political consequences. It undermined the authority of the crown. It created uncertainty about the succession. It gave ministers and politicians leverage to play one side against the other, and it demonstrated to the English people that the royal family was deeply dysfunctional. If George II was a disaster as a father and an unstable presence as a king, he did have one genuine passion: war. George II was obsessed with military matters. He wanted his kingdom to be a great military power. He wanted England to dominate European affairs through strength and force. This led to England's involvement in a series of conflicts, the most notable of which were the War of Jenkins' Ear and the 7 Years' War. The War of Jenkins' Ear is perhaps one of history's most absurd wars. It began with an incident in 1731. when a British ship captain named Robert Jenkins was attacked by Spanish forces. During the attack, his ear was cut off. Jenkins preserved the ear in a bottle and carried it with him. 7 years later, when Parliament demanded an explanation for British naval losses, Jenkins produced his ear. This severed ear, 7 years old and preserved in a bottle, became a symbol of British humiliation. Parliament was outraged, and George II, who loved a good fight, was eager to use this incident as justification for war with Spain. The War of Jenkins' Ear began in 1739 and lasted until 1748. It was expensive, it was bloody, and it accomplished very little. England gained some territory, but at enormous cost in lives and money. And George II's enthusiasm for the war never wavered, even when it became clear that it was not achieving the great victory he had imagined. After the War of Jenkins' Ear came the 7 Years' War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763. This was a far more significant conflict, one that would reshape the balance of power in Europe and around the world. England, under George II, fought against France for dominance. George II was nearly 80 years old when this war began, yet his enthusiasm for it never diminished. He wanted England to win. He wanted English forces to dominate, and he was willing to spend whatever was necessary to achieve that goal. The 7 Years' War was in many ways a success for England. English forces won significant victories. England emerged as a major global power, and yet this success came at enormous cost, and it was achieved not through George II's direct action, but through the efforts of capable military leaders and politicians. Beyond his temper and his passion for war, George II was characterized by numerous personal eccentricities that revealed the strange, often alienating nature of his personality. George II had an obsession with punctuality that bordered on pathological. He was never late to anything, and he expected everyone around him to be equally punctual. If someone arrived even a minute late to an appointment or a meal, George would explode in rage. He would shout, curse, and threaten. This obsession with punctuality had no rational purpose. It was simply a manifestation of his need for control and order. George II was also deeply vain. He was obsessed with his appearance, even as he aged. He wore elaborate clothing, heavy makeup, and powdered wigs. He spent enormous amounts of time on his grooming and his wardrobe. Yet despite all this attention to appearance, contemporary accounts suggest that he was not particularly attractive or impressive in person. More troubling was George II's relationship with his role as king. He saw the monarchy as a position of absolute power. He believed that his word should be law, that his desires should be instantly fulfilled, and that anyone who questioned his authority was acting with disloyalty or treason. This fundamentally misunderstood the reality of English governance. By the 18th century, England had developed a system where the king was powerful, but not absolute. Parliament had real authority. The Prime Minister had real power. And the people, through various means, had ways to influence their government. George II either didn't understand this or refused to acknowledge it. He constantly pushed against these limitations. He constantly tried to expand his power beyond what the system allowed. And this constant struggle created tensions and instability throughout his reign. George II inherited from his father, and would pass on to his successors, a particular attitude toward religion that combined indifference with anxiety. George II was Protestant, of course. Any Catholic monarch would have been unacceptable to English Parliament and people. But his Protestantism was not based on genuine belief or conviction. It was political necessity. George II showed little interest in religious matters. He attended church as required by his position. He participated in religious ceremonies, but there was no deep conviction behind any of it. Religion was simply another aspect of the machinery of kingship. to be observed when necessary but otherwise ignored. This had the effect of making George II seem even more remote and disconnected from his subjects. In the 18th century, religion was still a fundamental part of most people's lives. A king who seemed indifferent to religion seemed to be missing something essential, some core of humanity or conviction. As George II aged, his character did not mellow or improve. If anything, his eccentricities became more pronounced. His temper, if possible, became even shorter. His paranoia about his son Frederick, and later his grandson George III, intensified. His obsessions with punctuality and control became more extreme. Yet George II continued to rule. He refused to retire, refused to hand over power to his heirs, refused to acknowledge his own limitations. Even as he aged and his health declined, he clung to the throne with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to a log. The English people, by this point, were resigned to George II's eccentricities. They had experienced his anger and his odd behavior long enough to become accustomed to it. He was, in a sense, a known quantity. They understood what to expect from him, even if what they expected was not pleasant. One of the most revealing aspects of George II's personality was his obsession with details, with the minutiae of court life, of ceremony, of dress, of protocol. He would spend hours discussing the precise positioning of people at a formal dinner. He would become enraged if the livery of the servants was not exactly as he had specified. He would obsess over the exact wording of official documents. This obsession with detail suggests a kind of emotional disconnection from the larger picture. George II could be engaged and passionate about small, controllable matters, but when it came to larger questions, the welfare of his people, the long-term stability of his kingdom, the need for genuine connection with his subjects, he seemed lost and indifferent. George II ruled England for exactly 33 years, from 1727 until his death in 1760. He was 86 years old when he died, one of the longest living monarchs in English history. He had seen the world change around him. He'd seen England emerge as a global power. He had seen the Industrial Revolution begin to transform English society. And yet George II never really adapted to these changes. He remained a man of the 17th century, living in the 18th century, ruling a kingdom that was rapidly becoming something he didn't understand. When George II died on October 25th, 1760, he was mourned by few and forgotten by most. His grandson George III was immediately proclaimed king, and a new chapter of Hanoverian dysfunction began. George William Frederick, who would become King George III, was born on June 4th, 1738. He grew up in a palace filled with tension and conflict. His grandfather, George I, had been remote and disconnected. His father, George II, was explosive and unpredictable, and his own father, Frederick, had been locked in constant warfare with George II. Frederick died in 1751, when George was still a boy. This tragedy meant that George would become the heir to the throne, and eventually king, much sooner than anyone had anticipated. George was raised with the belief that he would be a great king. His tutors instilled in him a sense of destiny and responsibility. He was taught that he would be different from his predecessors, that he would be engaged, interested in his kingdom, and genuinely connected to his people. He was taught that he would restore the dignity and power of the monarchy. When George became king at age 22, following his grandfather's death in 1760, he was full of idealism and determination. Unlike his grandfather and great-grandfather, he spoke English as his first language. Unlike his father and great-grandfather, he had been born in England and considered himself English. He had a vision for what he wanted to accomplish as king. George III's early reign seemed to suggest that he might indeed be the reforming king that England needed. He took active interest in governance. He wanted to be involved in the important decisions. He established a close relationship with the Earl of Bute, who became his chief minister and advisor. George believed in the power of the monarchy. He believed that the king should be actively involved in the direction of his kingdom. He wanted to restore what he saw as the proper balance between the crown and parliament, with the crown in a position of greater authority than it currently held. But this belief in the power of the monarchy would lead George into conflict with Parliament and with the English people. The system that had developed over the previous century relied on a balance of power with no single force, not even the king, having complete authority. George's attempts to shift this balance were seen as threatening and dangerous. The defining issue of George III's early reign was the question of how to handle the American colonies. After the 7 Years' War, England had control of vast territories in North America, but these territories were expensive to govern and to defend. The English treasury was depleted from the cost of the war. George III and his government decided that the American colonies should bear part of the cost of their own defense. They began imposing taxes on the colonies. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. These taxes were meant to raise revenue for the English treasury. But the colonists were outraged. They had no representation in Parliament. They saw these taxes as an unjust imposition of authority without their consent. They protested. They resisted. And George III, believing strongly in the power and authority of the crown, refused to back down. What followed was a series of escalating confrontations. The Boston Massacre occurred in 1770. The Boston Tea Party occurred in 1773. In 1775, armed conflict broke out between British troops and American colonial militia at Lexington and Concord. George III was convinced that the colonists were in rebellion and that they would submit if England showed sufficient strength and determination. He pushed for military action. He refused to negotiate. He rejected peace proposals that would have granted the colonists greater autonomy or representation in Parliament. The American Revolution lasted from 1775 until 1783. It was a long, bloody conflict that consumed enormous resources and cost countless lives, and it ended with a British defeat. The American colonies achieved independence, and George III had to acknowledge that he had lost a vast portion of his empire. This was a devastating blow to George III. He had believed so strongly that the power and authority of the crown would compel obedience. He had been so certain that the American colonists would eventually capitulate, and instead, he had seen them achieve their freedom through armed rebellion. In 1761, George III married Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Unlike many royal marriages, which were loveless political arrangements, George genuinely loved Charlotte. They had a genuinely affectionate relationship, and they had many children, eventually 15, who survived to adulthood. This happy family life provided a kind of refuge for George III. At home, surrounded by his wife and children, he could be something other than a king trying to impose his will on an unwilling people. He could be a husband and a father. He could experience the simple pleasures of domestic life. But even his family life was affected by George III's emotional difficulties. He was a controlling father. He wanted his children to be perfectly behaved and perfectly obedient. He was invested in their success in ways that sometimes seemed unhealthy, and his sons, as they grew older, would begin to resent his control and his expectations. In 1788, George III experienced what seemed, at the time, to be a temporary illness. He became confused. His speech became rambling and incoherent. His behavior became erratic. His physicians were baffled. They didn't understand what was wrong with him. The symptoms lasted for several months. During this time, there was genuine concern about whether George could continue to function as king. Parliament debated establishing a regency, which would give power to the Prince of Wales, George's eldest son, to act as regent while George was incapacitated. But George recovered. By the beginning of 1789, he seemed to return to relative normalcy. His speech cleared up. His confusion faded. He seemed to be back to his previous state of health and mental stability. Everyone was relieved. Parliament abandoned the discussion of a regency. Life returned to normal. But normal was never truly restored. There were whispers and doubts. People wondered if George's illness might recur. They wondered what had caused it. They wondered whether George was truly well or merely seemed well. It would be centuries before medical science would understand what had actually afflicted George III. We now know that he almost certainly suffered from a condition called porphyria, a metabolic disorder that affects the nervous system and can produce symptoms that appear identical to madness. But in the 18th century, no one understood this. They simply knew that the king sometimes seemed mad. They made up theories and explanations. Some believed it was caused by stress. Some believed it was caused by hereditary illness in the Hanoverian line. Some believed it was a punishment from God for his sins, real or imagined. The uncertainty about the cause of his condition added to the fear and confusion surrounding his illness. If they didn't know what had caused it, how could they be sure it wouldn't recur? How could they be certain that George would remain capable of governing? While George III was struggling with his own mental health, England was also being drawn into conflict with France. The French Revolution had begun in 1789. Initially, there was hope in England that this revolution might lead to a more enlightened form of government. But as the revolution became increasingly radical and violent, English opinion turned against it. By 1793, England had entered into war with France. This war would continue, with various interruptions, for over 20 years. It was known as the Revolutionary Wars, and later as the Napoleonic Wars. As Napoleon rose to power in France, George III was deeply opposed to revolutionary ideals. He saw the French Revolution as a threat not just to France, but to all of Europe, including England. He was determined that England should stand against revolutionary France. He committed English resources to the war effort. He supported various coalitions of European powers allied against France. This war consumed enormous resources. It dragged on for year after year. It seemed that every time one enemy was defeated, another arose. The war became unpopular at home. The cost in lives and money seemed unjustifiable, and yet George III remained committed to fighting it. In 1801, George III experienced another episode of illness. Once again, his mind seemed to deteriorate. Once again, his speech became rambling and incoherent. Once again, there was fear that he might not recover. This time, the episode was more severe and lasted longer. George spent months in a state of confusion. During this time, he had to withdraw from active participation in government. His son, the Prince of Wales, was called upon to assume greater responsibilities. But once again, George recovered. By the end of the episode, he seemed to return to something approaching normality. But this second episode reinforced people's fears. It seemed that George III's mental illness might be recurrent. It might return at any time. And given the long conflict with France that showed no sign of ending, people were terrified about what might happen if their king became incapacitated during such a crucial time. As the years passed, and George III continued to experience episodes of illness, separated by periods of apparent health, a fundamental question arose. Was George III fit to continue ruling? Should he be forced to abdicate in favor of his son, who might be more capable and more stable? This was a dangerous question to even ask, because it raised the spectre of regicide, or at least the forced removal of a reigning monarch. It contradicted the principle of divine right, which held that the king had been appointed by God and could not be removed by men. It suggested that perhaps the king's authority was not absolute, that perhaps he could be held accountable for his fitness to rule. These were revolutionary ideas in the truest sense of the word. They suggested that the people, through Parliament, had the right to determine whether their king was capable of governing. They suggested that loyalty to the king was not absolute, but conditional on his fitness to rule. George III himself was terrified of being removed from power. He fought against any suggestion that he should retire or hand over authority. He clung to his position as king with a desperate intensity. Even as his mind occasionally failed him, even as his grip on reality sometimes seemed tenuous, he insisted on his right to rule. From 1811 until 1820, George III was no longer capable of governing. A formal regency was established, with the Prince of Wales assuming the title of Prince Regent and acting as king in all but name. During these years, George III lived in seclusion. He was confined to Kew Palace, under the care of physicians and attendants. He was physically alive, but mentally, he was no longer truly present. He seemed to inhabit a private world of his own, disconnected from the world around him. During this period, he experienced what seems to have been a complete mental breakdown. He had conversations with people who weren't there. He believed he was having conversations with people long dead. He seemed to lose track of time, unable to distinguish between past and present. He would speak in incomprehensible sentences, mixing multiple languages and topics together. This was the tragedy of George III at its most complete. A man who had begun his reign with such high hopes and such determination to be a great king had been reduced to a prisoner in his own palace, his mind entirely gone, unable to recognize even his own family members. George III's long illness and the establishment of the Regency had significant effects on English politics and society. For the first time, it became clear that the continuity of the monarchy did not depend on the health or mental stability of an individual king. The system of governance could continue even when the king was incapacitated. This was, in a sense, liberating. It meant that Parliament's authority could not be threatened by the illness or madness of a single individual. But it also meant that the king's authority was diminished. If the kingdom could be governed without the king actively governing, then perhaps the king's power was not as essential or absolute as had been believed. The Regency period also allowed for a kind of cultural flourishing. With the king incapacitated and the Prince Regent having established his authority, there was a period of relative political stability. Artists, writers, and musicians could work without the immediate fear of political upheaval. This era came to be known as the Regency period, and it produced some of the finest literature, architecture, and art of the English-speaking world. George III died on January 29, 1820, at the age of 81. He had ruled for nearly 60 years, but for the last 9 years of his life, he had been completely absent from power. He had seen his kingdom change around him. The American colonies had become a separate nation. The French Revolution had transformed Europe. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping English society. And yet, he had been unable to influence any of these events. His legacy was deeply mixed. In his early years, he had hoped to be a great and powerful king. He had wanted to restore the authority of the monarchy and to assert his personal will over the direction of the kingdom. Instead, he had demonstrated that the system of English governance was more resilient and adaptable than any individual king, and he had shown that even a king could fall victim to illness and madness, that even the most powerful person in the realm was subject to forces beyond his control. George William Henry, who would become King George III, was born on August 12, 1762. He was the eldest son of George III, and from his earliest years it was clear that he would be very different from his father. Where George III was dutiful and serious, George IV was indulgent and pleasure-seeking. Where George III believed in order and propriety, George IV seemed determined to violate every convention and expectation placed upon him. Where George III was frugal and conscious of the cost of his actions, George IV was recklessly extravagant. From his youth, George IV was attracted to the finer things in life. He loved beautiful objects. He loved fine art. He loved elegant clothing. He loved expensive food and wine. These tastes might not have been problematic in themselves, except that George IV pursued them with an intensity and lack of moderation that made them catastrophic. As a young man, George IV was genuinely charming. He was tall and handsome. He had wit and intelligence. He had an engaging manner. Women found him attractive. Men found him engaging company. And unlike his father, he seemed to actually enjoy life and the company of others. But underneath this charm was something darker. George IV was deeply insecure. He was desperate for approval and admiration. He was constantly seeking validation. And he was willing to spend money he didn't have, to make promises he couldn't keep, and to violate moral and legal boundaries in pursuit of pleasure and attention. The first major scandal involving George IV was his secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert. Maria was a widow, several years older than George, and a Catholic. Both of these facts made a marriage to the heir of the English throne extraordinarily problematic. In 1784, when George IV was 22 years old, he met Maria Fitzherbert. He became obsessed with her. He wanted to marry her. Maria resisted, understanding that such a marriage would be political suicide. But George was determined. He threatened to kill himself if she refused him. He swore eternal love. He made elaborate promises. Finally, Maria gave in. In 1785, George married her secretly. The marriage was conducted by a Catholic priest in private. No one else was present except a few close friends and confidants. The marriage was secret because if it became public, it would cause a constitutional crisis. George was in line to the throne of a Protestant kingdom. A marriage to a Catholic woman was forbidden by law. For several years, the marriage remained secret. Only a few people knew about it. George and Maria lived together as husband and wife, though they had to be careful to keep the relationship hidden from public view. But secrets have a way of leaking out. By 1787, rumours of the marriage were circulating in London society. Parliament demanded an explanation. George denied the marriage. He claimed it was all a lie, a calumnious rumour spread by his enemies. Maria, devastated by George's denial, left England and went into exile. She eventually returned, but she never forgot the pain of George's public denial of their marriage. George, meanwhile, moved on to new scandals and new indulgences. As George IV aged, his gambling became increasingly problematic. He would gamble enormous sums of money. He would spend entire nights at the card table, betting thousands of pounds on the turn of a card. When he won, he would be exhilarated, convinced that he had found a source of unlimited wealth. When he lost, he would convince himself that he would win it back next time. The result was that George III accumulated enormous debts. His extravagance in clothing, food, art, and entertainment, combined with his gambling losses, meant that he was constantly short of money. He would beg Parliament for additional funds. He would plead with his father for loans. He would make promises to creditors that he couldn't keep. By 1795, George IV's debts had become so enormous that they seemed impossible to repay. He owed hundreds of thousands of pounds, enormous sums of money in that era. His creditors were threatening legal action. His life seemed to be falling apart financially. In desperation, George agreed to do something he had been resisting for years. He agreed to marry a woman chosen by his father, a woman who could provide him with substantial wealth and hopefully produce an heir to the throne. In 1795, George married Princess Caroline of Brunswick. Caroline was the daughter of the Duke of Brunswick, and she came with a substantial dowry. But more importantly, from the perspective of Parliament and George III, Caroline was Protestant, and she could be expected to produce an heir. But the marriage was a disaster from the beginning. George and Caroline despised each other. They had nothing in common. Caroline was simple and unsophisticated. George was refined and cultured, or thought himself to be. Caroline was exuberant and loud. George was uncomfortable with her lack of reserve. On their wedding night, George was so drunk and so unhappy that he could barely perform his marital duties. Observers reported that the marriage was consummated only with great difficulty and after considerable time had passed. But the marriage did produce a child, a daughter named Charlotte. This was enough to satisfy Parliament and to silence critics of the marriage. George now had an heir. He had fulfilled his dynastic obligations, and he immediately began to neglect his wife and return to his dissolute lifestyle. In 1784, George had been given Carlton House, a large mansion in London, to serve as his residence as heir to the throne. Most heirs would have been content with a nice mansion, but George saw Carlton House as an opportunity to create something extraordinary. He hired one of the greatest architects of the age, Henry Holland, to redesign and rebuild Carlton House. No expense was spared. George wanted the most luxurious, the most beautiful, the most impressive residence in all of England. The rebuilding of Carlton House became almost an legendary extravagance. Holland designed and built rooms of extraordinary opulence. He incorporated the finest materials available. He commissioned works of art from the greatest artists of the age. He created a residence that was less a home than a museum, or a monument to wealth and excess. The cost was staggering. It consumed enormous sums of money. George went into debt to pay for it, but he didn't care. To him, Carlton House was worth any amount of money. It was a reflection of his taste, his wealth, his importance. When Carlton House was finally completed, it was indeed one of the most impressive buildings in London. But it also became a symbol of George's extravagance and his disconnection from the concerns of ordinary people. While ordinary Londoners struggled with poverty and want, their future king was spending enormous sums of money on the decoration of a private mansion. As George III's various scandals accumulated, the secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert, the debts, the gambling, the open affairs with multiple women, people began to question his fitness to be king. They wondered whether such a man, so obsessed with pleasure and so careless about his responsibilities, should ever be allowed to rule. These questions were particularly acute because of the ongoing struggle with George III's mental illness. If George III became permanently incapacitated, the succession would pass to George IV. The thought of this dissolute, irresponsible man becoming king was deeply troubling to many people. There were even rumours, whispered but not entirely secret, that George IV was not the legitimate son of George III. These rumours were almost certainly false, but they circulated nonetheless. They reflected the deep anxiety people felt about having George as a potential king. In 1811, when George III became permanently incapacitated, George IV assumed the role of Prince Regent. He had been agitating for this position for years, demanding that Parliament grant him authority to act in his father's stead. Now he finally had it. As Prince Regent, George IV had the power to govern without actually being king. He could make decisions, command military forces, and shape policy. But he still had to answer to Parliament, and his authority was technically temporary, lasting only as long as George III lived. The Regency period was a time of significant change in English culture and society. With a different person in charge, With different priorities and different tastes, London became a centre of artistic and cultural innovation. The Regency style in architecture, fashion, and furniture became synonymous with elegance and refinement. George IV used his position as Prince Regent to advance his cultural interests. He was a patron of the arts. He commissioned great works of architecture. He supported artists and writers. His court became a centre of cultural sophistication that rivaled the courts of any European nation. But the Regency was also a time of growing radicalism and political tension. The wars with France were ongoing and costly. The Industrial Revolution was creating new social classes and new political movements. The seeds of what would become Chartism and other reform movements were being sown. And George, for all his cultural interests, was politically conservative. He opposed reform. He was suspicious of democratic ideas. He believed in the power of the aristocracy and the crown. While George was serving as Prince Regent, his marriage to Caroline continued to be troubled and unhappy. George wanted a divorce, but he couldn't get one because it would have been politically damaging, and because divorce was extraordinarily difficult in that era. Instead, George simply ignored his wife. Caroline lived separately from him. She travelled. She lived a relatively independent life. And George pursued other relationships openly. But in 1820, when George III died, and George became king, the question of his marriage suddenly became urgent. Caroline, now queen, demanded to be crowned and recognised as queen. She wanted to come to London to take her place in the royal household. George was appalled. He wanted nothing to do with her. He wanted to pretend the marriage didn't exist. George actually introduced a bill in Parliament to dissolve the marriage. He wanted to divorce Caroline through an Act of Parliament. The trial that followed was one of the most scandalous events in English history. Evidence of Caroline's infidelities was presented. Evidence of George's own infidelities and misdeeds was presented. The affair became public spectacle. The public, interestingly, sympathized with Caroline. George was widely despised for trying to humiliate his wife. Riots broke out in support of Caroline. People marched through the streets, shouting slogans in her defense. The government had to drop the divorce proceedings, fearing public disorder. Caroline never was crowned as queen. She was barred from the coronation ceremony. The scandal wounded both her and George deeply. Caroline died in 1821, just months after George became king. George himself seemed not to care. He simply moved on to other matters. George IV became king in 1820, following his father's death. He was 58 years old. He was no longer young, but he threw himself into the role of king with enthusiasm. As king, George IV could finally indulge his interests in art, architecture, and culture without worrying about money. He had access to the royal treasury. He used this access to commission great works. He renovated Buckingham Palace. He created the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, a magnificent building that combined European and Asian architectural influences in a way that was strikingly original and beautiful. George IV was a great patron of the arts. He supported painters, sculptors, writers, and musicians. He collected fine art and accumulated one of the greatest art collections of the age. His court became a centre of cultural sophistication. But George's reign as king was relatively brief. He was already in declining health. His years of excess, the gambling, the drinking, the heavy eating, had taken their toll on his body. He was overweight, prone to illness, and increasingly sedentary. As king, George also faced significant political challenges. The question of Catholic emancipation was becoming increasingly urgent. George had strong opinions on the matter, and they were not always popular. Reform movements were beginning to demand greater representation and political change. George resisted these movements, believing firmly in the old system of aristocratic governance. George IV died on June 26, 1830, at the age of 67. His reign as king had lasted only 10 years. By the end, his health had been so poor that he was barely able to function. He had been confined to bed much of the time, suffering from gout, obesity, and various ailments related to his years of excess. When he died, he was not mourned as George III had not been mourned. Instead, there was a sense of relief. George III had spent his entire life pursuing pleasure and indulgence. He had accumulated debts that took years for the nation to repay. He had scandalized the monarchy with his behavior and his relationships, and he had failed to advance the cause of good governance or social reform. Yet George IV left behind a cultural legacy that was more significant than his political legacy. The art he commissioned, the buildings he created, the support he gave to artists and writers, these things lasted beyond his reign. The Regency period came to be remembered as a time of great cultural achievement, even if the prince and king who presided over it was fundamentally flawed and deeply self-indulgent. William Henry, who would become King William IV, was born on August 21st, 1765. For most of his life, he had no expectation of becoming king. He was the third son of George III. As long as his older brothers had sons, William's chances of inheriting the throne seemed remote. This relative distance from power allowed William to live a life very different from his older brother George. Instead of being groomed for kingship, William was encouraged to pursue a military career. He joined the Royal Navy as a young man and spent his youth at sea. William's naval career was not particularly distinguished. He was not a great naval strategist or a brilliant commander, but he was a naval officer, and this fact defined his personality in profound ways. He developed a sailor's manner. He was hearty, loud, and seemingly unconcerned with the niceties of courtly behavior. William spent nearly 2 decades in the Royal Navy. He saw action in various naval conflicts. He achieved the rank of admiral, though more through his status as a royal prince than through any particular military genius. He traveled widely, visiting different ports and different countries. He developed a kind of wanderer's perspective, a sense that the world was larger and more complex than the narrow world of the British court. During his naval years, William also fathered numerous illegitimate children. He had a series of mistresses, mostly women of lower social standing, and by several of these women he had children. By the time William left active service, he had fathered at least 10 illegitimate children, whose mothers came from various ranks of society. This scandalous behavior should have disqualified William from ever becoming king. But as long as he remained far from power, these indiscretions were largely overlooked. He was the younger son, the sailor, the man who lived by different rules. His illegitimate children were acknowledged but not recognized officially. His affairs were known but not widely publicized. But circumstances changed. George III's daughter, Princess Charlotte, died in childbirth in 1817. Charlotte had been in line to inherit the throne. With her death, the direct line of succession became uncertain. George III was still alive but declining. George IV had no legitimate children other than Charlotte. The succession to William IV and his other brothers suddenly seemed possible. This created an extraordinary situation. Multiple middle-aged and elderly men who had not been raised to be king suddenly found themselves in a position where one of them would likely inherit the throne. There was a kind of succession scramble, with various princes attempting to strengthen their claims. When George III died in 1820, George IV became king, but George IV was already aging and in poor health. It seemed possible that he would not live very long. When George IV died in 1830, the succession passed to William IV, the sailor who had spent his life far from the court and far from power. William was 65 years old when he became king. By the standards of the time, this was quite old. He had no recent experience in governance. He had spent decades in the Navy, and then in various minor positions away from the center of power. He had no established court faction supporting him. He had no clear vision of what he wanted to accomplish as king. William IV's coronation was a relatively modest affair compared to the lavish ceremonies of his brother. William seemed to have little interest in ceremony or tradition. He wanted to be crowned and get on with the business of being king. What William cared about was efficiency and directness. He was accustomed to the hierarchies and chains of command of the military. He wanted clear authority, clear responsibility, and clear results. He was impatient with the elaborate protocol of court life. He was dismissive of ceremony and ritual. This approach had some positive effects. William was genuinely concerned with efficiency in government. He wanted to reform the systems of administration and reduce waste and corruption. He was willing to consider new ideas and new approaches. But William's impatience with ceremony and tradition also made him seem uncouth and ungainly to the aristocratic elite who dominated English society. They thought he lacked refinement. They thought he was too common, too much like a military man, and not enough like a proper king. There was a sense that the monarchy had fallen into the hands of someone who didn't truly understand how it should be conducted. The defining issue of William IV's reign was the Great Reform Act of 1832. This act fundamentally transformed the system of representation in Parliament. It eliminated pocket boroughs, districts that were controlled by a single powerful individual. It extended the right to vote beyond the landed aristocracy to include merchants, manufacturers, and other men of property. The Reform Act was deeply controversial. The old aristocracy opposed it, fearing that it would diminish their power. But reformers and progressives championed it as a necessary step toward greater democracy and representation. William IV was reluctant about the Reform Act. He was conservative by nature and by upbringing. He feared that reform might lead to radical change and social upheaval. But he was also intelligent enough to understand that if he refused reform entirely, the pressure for change would only grow stronger. The crisis over the Reform Act came to a head in 1831 and 1832. Parliament passed the Act. The House of Lords rejected it. Massive public protests erupted. People marched through the streets demanding reform. There were riots and civil unrest. It seemed possible that the conflict between the king and Parliament, between the forces of reform and the forces of tradition, might tear the nation apart. William IV finally did something extraordinary. He threatened to create new peers, new members of the House of Lords, if the existing peers did not vote to pass the Reform Act. This threat worked. The existing peers, fearing that their exclusive club would be diluted by new members, voted to accept the Reform Act. It passed in 1832. This was a significant moment in English history. The king had not prevented reform. Instead, he had facilitated it, even though it was against his personal preferences. This set a precedent that the monarchy could adapt to change, that the king could accept democratic reform even if he personally opposed it. But the experience left William IV deeply troubled. He felt that he had betrayed his principles. He had compromised with the forces of reform. He had seen his power diminished. He had been forced to accept change that he did not believe in. Beyond his political positions, William IV was characterized by numerous personal eccentricities that made him seem even more unusual and out of place as a king. William had acquired during his naval years an extremely informal manner. He would address people directly and without ceremony. He would use nautical language and expressions in formal settings. He would make jokes and laugh loudly. He seemed entirely unconcerned with the dignity and decorum that were expected of a king. William was also deeply interested in horses. He had a passion for horsemanship and for horse racing. He would spend hours discussing horses and racing with anyone who would listen. This interest sometimes seemed to consume him more than affairs of state. William also had a fascination with medicine and medical procedures. He would discuss medical topics in inappropriate settings. He seemed genuinely interested in the details of illnesses and treatments. This fascination sometimes made him seem morbid or inappropriate. More troubling was William's attitude toward his many illegitimate children. He had fathered numerous children out of wedlock, yet he seemed to have little interest in their welfare or their futures. He acknowledged them as his children, but he did nothing to support them or to provide for their education or advancement. This callous attitude was shocking even by the standards of the time, when illegitimacy was shameful and when support for illegitimate children was not expected. Despite having numerous illegitimate children, William IV had no legitimate heir when he became king. This was a major problem for the monarchy. If William died without a legitimate heir, the succession would be unclear. There could be a succession crisis that would throw the entire nation into uncertainty. William married Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen in 1818, before he became king. Adelaide was a widow with 2 children from her previous marriage, but Adelaide and William had no children together. As William aged, and it became clear that Adelaide would not bear him any children, the question of the succession became increasingly urgent. There was speculation that perhaps one of William's illegitimate children might be legitimized so that he could inherit the throne, but there was no precedent for this, and the idea seemed unsettling to people who cared about the proper conduct of monarchy. The question of the succession was only resolved when William's niece, Victoria, the daughter of his brother Edward and Victoria of Saxe-Coburg, reached maturity. Victoria would become his heir. It seemed likely that she would become queen after William's death. William IV ruled as king for only 7 years, from 1830 until his death in 1837. He was 71 years old when he died, having reigned only briefly. His reign was not marked by great accomplishments or enduring achievements, but it was marked by adaptation and change. William had been forced to accept the Reform Act, even though he opposed it. He had been forced to acknowledge that the world was changing, that the old system of aristocratic governance could not persist unchanged. He had been forced to accept that the monarchy could not simply impose its will on the nation, but had to work within a system of parliamentary compromise. When William died on June 20, 1837, the throne passed to his niece Victoria. A new era of monarchy would begin, one that would be defined by Victoria's long reign and her particular vision of what the monarchy should be. As we come to the end of our peaceful journey through the Hanoverian kings, it's worth stepping back and reflecting on what we've learned about these extraordinary men and their extraordinary failures. The Hanoverian Dynasty was, in many ways, a dynasty of men who were fundamentally out of touch with the world around them. George V couldn't speak English and had no interest in learning. George II was explosive and unpredictable, driven by anger and the need for control. George III pursued an ideal of absolute monarchy that the nation had moved beyond. George IV was so obsessed with pleasure and luxury that he neglected the basic duties of a king. And William IV was such an eccentric that people wondered if he truly understood what being a king meant. These were men of varying abilities and varying degrees of intelligence. George III was genuinely intelligent and capable. George III was competent enough as a ruler of Hanover, but all of them shared a fundamental characteristic. They were disconnected from the people they ruled. They lived in a world of court life, of ceremony, of formality. They were isolated by their rank, by their power, and by their own psychological limitations from the lives and experiences of ordinary people. Yet despite these kings' many failures and eccentricities, the English system of government not only survived, but actually improved and evolved. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Hanoverian period. The The system was more resilient than any individual ruler. When George I was disengaged, Parliament and the Prime Minister took over. When George II's temper made him unsuitable for direct governance, the system adapted. When George III's mind failed, a regency was established. When George IV pursued pleasure instead of duty, the system continued to function. This adaptability suggests something important about the English system of governance that was being developed during this period. It wasn't dependent on the virtue or the capability of a single individual. It had built-in mechanisms for handling incompetence and dysfunction. It had distributed power among multiple institutions so that no single person could bring the entire system down. The Hanoverian period marked the end of personal monarchy, the system where the king personally wielded significant power and where the king's personality and abilities directly determined the quality of governance. By the end of William IV's reign, it was clear that England was moving toward a system where the monarchy was powerful symbolically, but limited practically. The Prime Minister had become the true chief executive. Parliament had become the true source of authority. This transformation was not planned or intentional. It happened gradually, as a result of circumstances and necessity. But by the time Victoria came to the throne in 1837, it was clear that the character of English governance had fundamentally changed. The king or queen would still be important, would still be respected, would still be the symbol of the nation. But the day-to-day business of governance would be conducted by the Prime Minister and Parliament, not by the monarch. The Hanoverian period was, in many ways, a strange and sometimes comical period of history. We have kings who couldn't speak the language of their kingdom. We have royal fathers and sons who despised each other. We have a king driven mad by illness. We have a king so addicted to luxury that he nearly bankrupted the nation. We have a king who seemed more suited to the navy than to court. And yet, during this period, England was transformed. The Industrial Revolution occurred. England became a global power. English science, English art, English literature flourished. The system of parliamentary government developed. The foundations were laid for the great age of the British Empire. This paradox, that such a strange and often inept series of rulers presided over such a remarkable period of national development, suggests something important about how history actually works. The great movements and forces of history are often larger than any individual. A king can be inept or out of touch, and the nation can still progress. The system can adapt to the failings of those who lead it. The Hanoverian Dynasty formally ended with the death of William IV in 1837. Victoria's accession to the throne marked the beginning of a new era. Victoria had a different personality, different values, and a different vision of what the monarchy should be. But the structures and systems that had developed during the Hanoverian period persisted. The Prime Minister continued to be the chief executive. Parliament continued to be the true seat of political power. The monarchy continued to be symbolically powerful, while practically limited. The Hanoverians had shown, through their very disconnection and dysfunction, how a system of government could remain stable even when individual rulers were problematic. They had demonstrated, through their various failures, the importance of institutional structure and distributed power. As we conclude this journey through the Hanoverian kings, it's worth reflecting on what their stories might teach us about leadership, about connection between leaders and the people they lead, and about the importance of institutions in maintaining governmental stability. The Hanoverian kings were powerful men. They had the authority to make laws. They could command armies. They could determine the fate of nations. And yet many of them were fundamentally disconnected from the people they ruled. They didn't understand their subjects. They didn't speak their language. They didn't share their values or concerns. This disconnection between leaders and the people they lead is something that transcends historical period. It's a perennial danger. Leaders can become isolated by their power, can become so surrounded by people who tell them what they want to hear that they lose touch with reality. They can become so invested in their own vision of how things should be that they fail to see how things actually are. The story of the Hanoverians is a cautionary tale about the dangers of such disconnection. It's a story about what happens when leaders are out of touch with those they lead. It's a story about the importance of systems and institutions that can survive the failings of individual leaders. One of the great legacies of the Hanoverian period was that it demonstrated the genius of English governance, not in the quality of its monarchs, but in the resilience of its institutions. The system worked not because the kings were great or wise, but because no single king could break the system. The system had enough built-in checks and balances that it could withstand even kings who were mad, dissolute, out of touch, or temperamentally unsuited to rule. This was a remarkable achievement. Many nations have suffered because they depended too heavily on the virtue and ability of their leaders. Nations have fallen into chaos because they had no institutional structures strong enough to survive the failings of individual leaders. England avoided this trap. By the end of the Hanoverian period, England had a system of government that could function even when its nominal head was incapable of functioning. As we close this chapter on the Hanoverian kings, those strange, out-of-touch rulers who presided over one of history's most remarkable transformations, were left with a complex legacy. These were not great men. They were not wise leaders. Many of them were deeply flawed, driven by anger or indulgence or mental illness or simple disconnection from the world around them. And yet they ruled over a period that saw the rise of modern democracy, the development of industrial society, and the transformation of England from a regional power into a global empire. They reigned over poets and writers and artists who created some of the greatest works of English literature and art. They presided over a nation that was fundamentally changing and improving, even as they themselves remained trapped in old patterns and old ways of thinking. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of the Hanoverians. Great historical progress does not require great leaders. Systems and institutions matter more than individuals. A nation can move forward despite its leaders' failings if it has the right structures in place. And sometimes the greatest accomplishments happen not because of the vision of those in charge, but despite their limitations and their disconnection from the world around them. And so, we come to the end of our 3-hour journey through the Hanoverian chaos. We've travelled from George III, the German king who couldn't speak English, through his descendants, each more peculiar and more out of touch than the last. We've seen kingdoms lost and minds broken. We've seen luxury and extravagance. We've seen anger and eccentricity. And through it all, we've seen a nation and a system that endured despite its leaders' failures. If you're still awake, you're in the minority. Most of our listeners will have drifted off long ago into peaceful sleep, carrying these strange stories of out-of-touch kings into their dreams. And that's perfect. That's exactly what we hoped for. Thank you for spending this time with us, for listening to these tales of Hanoverian dysfunction and English resilience. We hope that somewhere in these stories you found something that spoke to you, something that made you think, or made you smile, or simply helped carry you gently towards sleep. If you enjoyed this journey through the Hanoverian chaos, please do leave a comment below. Tell us which king fascinated you most. Tell us what you thought of their stories. We genuinely love hearing from our listeners, and every comment helps us know that our work is appreciated. And please, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. New episodes of Sleepy Crown come regularly, each one exploring the strange and wonderful world of history in a way that's designed to carry you peacefully towards sleep. Subscribe now and you'll get notified whenever we release a new episode. We hope you sleep well tonight, carrying with you the memory of these strange and out-of-touch kings. Until next time, dear listener, rest well. This is Sleepy Crown, where history helps you sleep. Good night.